Yep, there you
go. So excellent. So thanks all for coming. Feel free to turn your cameras on if you want. It's I give this talk to a blank screen a lot of times, and so it's lovely to actually see people. But I will power on. So I'm told 45 minutes, including questions. So I'll try and I'll punch through this and then leave some time for questions, because I think you're an interesting audience, a more diverse, different audience than I normally speak to. Normally I'm in very constrained in the medical space. And so you're also, I think, significantly more experienced than many of the people I talk to, often talking to startups. So I'd be very interested in some of the questions that you might have, and I'll be very happy to answer pretty much anything you might ask. So this is the talk, developing a new clinically relevant ICU ventilator, FAST, ICU being an intensive care unit. This is me. We already talked about me a bit. So Starfish is a consultancy, works for other companies developing products and technology in the medical device space. So you can see a sort of a range of the sorts of products that Starfish works on, typically complex electromechanical systems with some software control, and then we also speak to our place in machine learning and AI, as we make machines that make data, is kind of the Starfish role in all of that. The company itself has 2 locations. I'm actually sitting in Victoria, British Columbia. We also have a significant office in Toronto, Ontario, about 150, maybe it's heading towards 170 staff at this point. Been doing this for 21 years. 80% of the customers are in the US, 20% in Canada. We're totally focused on North America as the market. So you may have seen something like this before. You can see it places. They make the point, you can have three kinds of service: good, cheap, fast, and you can pick only 2. Typically, these signs are put up by people who are really, what they're telling you is, I'm going to do it the way I always do it, and it's not going to be cheap, it's not going to be good, and it's not going to be fast. But it's kind of an interesting way into thinking about the triple constraints that project management knows very well. And the words that I prefer to use are scope, cost, and time, all bound together by quality. And different companies and different projects live on this triangle in different places. Oftentimes, companies or someone starting something will be bootstrapping. They will have they're going to try and prove something. They've got an idea, they know it's true, they believe it's true, and as they raise money, they will move towards it, and it will take however long it takes. Maybe they get some success, and now they want a minimally viable product, and they're going to, they have some money, and they have to get it done in a certain length of time, and because their investors have said, here's some money, I need it done, you need to have a result in this time. They have a certain burn rate, and so they will achieve a minimum, flexible level of scope that will hit what that minimally viable level is. And the space I work in at the moment, medical devices, minimally viable is a pretty high bar, but it's certainly flexible. And then with continued success, quite often there's the next stage is where they'll either be an incumbent company, a large company that has funds and has made a commitment to launch a product by a certain time, or they're well funded by venture capitalists or so on, in which case they have a good amount of money, but they have a certain amount of time, and when that time runs out, they stand a good chance to lose control of a large part of their company. So in that case, the scope and time are what constrained, and spending more money to go faster is possible. And so the project I'm going to talk about today fits very, very firmly in this well-funded space. So we were given substantial funds to complete a ventilator for Canada. And this is the product that I'm talking about. So if you all cast your minds back to February 2020, gosh, was it only 18 months ago? There were Italian doctors in corridors crying because they were having to make choices about which patients got ventilators and which didn't. There was a significant concern that the number of ventilators available in each country were very, very limited. There were also all sorts of, each nation state was establishing barriers to protect its own personal supply chain of components. And also the mainline manufacturers were ramping their production of ventilators as fast as they could to meet the demand. But the key thing for us is we got a call a call from the Canadian government to say they were looking for alternate designs for ventilators. The mainstream ventilator manufacturers were doing what they could. The instances of COVID were doubling every 3 days, and so there was no therapy or treatment apparent. Could we help them evaluate some of the solutions that were available? And so they suggested one in Ontario that we went to visit, and it was not we didn't think it was met the need at all. And then they had also discovered a candidate in Winnipeg. This was this was a prototype that was created by an inventor called Dr. Magdi Yunus in the early 1990s. The product was developed and turned into one of the early Medtronic ventilators, which then was the technology was eventually surpassed and supplanted, and new ventilators were being built in a different way at all. But this prototype existed. It was Canadian. He owned sufficient rights to it to make it a solution. So two colleagues, Christian McMeekin and Wes Chamberlain, and I flew to Winnipeg. It was a strange time to be flying. Everyone else was flying home. We were flying away from home. But we arrived in Winnipeg on this day, the March 21st, 2020. You can see the headline on the paper that day. And the next day we went into the office. And this is what we found. So we found this. This is the prototype ventilator, the box, the green, silver, and blue fronted box. The rest of this is test equipment. And you can see that it's a fairly well finished prototype of its time. A wired circuit board, which some of you, well, actually many of you may have seen before. Many times I show this to an audience, they've never seen such a thing. And we got to work immediately. So you can see Christian here, who is an electronics engineer with a very great breadth of experience, and also has a lot of understanding of systems and how they connect in the component pieces and how they control theory and so on. And he got to work understanding ventilators. We had worked in the ventilator space previously, but we had never designed a ventilator. And so Christian was understanding from Dr. Yunus, who's standing there in the gray sweater vest, exactly how this ventilator worked and how they worked in general. And meanwhile, over on the other side of the room, as you can see here in his black t-shirt, was Wes. Wes was reviewing the documents that existed for this component or this system. And the other thing that he started to do at that time was to devise the architecture. What were the essential pieces of this ventilator? How could and should it be segmented to meet the challenge that we were facing of how to develop this ventilator and get it into production very quickly indeed. Because again, the idea that the cases were doubling every 3 days. If we finished 3 days earlier, we would save half the people. So we wanted to move fast. So after a long day in Winnipeg, we packaged up one of these systems, shipped it to Victoria, and got back on the plane and flew home along with a bunch of students returning from a German field trip, and got straight to work. About a week later, this guy, who you all should recognize still, is still the Prime Minister of Canada. Justin Trudeau announced that Starfish would be one of the companies leading the charge to produce 30,000 ventilators. Now that's a lot of ventilators, and that was distributed across a number of companies. So showing you the timeline of what happened, and just as a little bit of a framework, I'm going to show you the timeline of what we did, and then dig a little bit deeper into some of the pieces that we did to give this project its success. So pretty quickly, we had a mock-up of the system. You can see it's cardboard based. This is our preferred initial modeling of equipment. When you do something in CAD, a couple of things is, one is it's hard to get an appreciation of true scale. The second thing is it's very easy to get attached to your design, having spent the time to create the CAD. So instead, we like to make it out of cardboard. It's easy to understand what you've got, and at the same time, it's easy to change. But you'll notice that the user interface on this is already very well defined. This is a piece of paper printed with the interface. It's not manufactured at all, but it's an understanding of how we would be doing the interface was critical. Then we procured the subsystems and laid them out on a bench and assembled them, tested them, got them working together, and put in place the controls that are necessary. Ventilators, so ventilators, for those I should have said perhaps earlier. So this is a product that this sustains life, but it replaces the breathing of the patient. You place a tube into the patient's lungs. You breathe for that patient so their lungs expand and contract. And in doing so, it's very easy. First goal is to save their life, but the second thing is, having saved their life, you want to ensure that they have a good continuing quality of life afterwards. So there are a lot of very important controls to ensure that you're not damaging the patient's lungs. The next piece then was we built some units with bare sheet metal, as you can see, and demonstrated that the unit as a whole could operate. We then set up a production line so first units could be built. And during all of this, there was a lot of testing too. There's a lot of regulations about test standards that need to be tested to. But by June 19th, we had made our successful submission to Health Canada. And so in medical devices, you need to follow through, create a design history file of requirements, architecture, risk analysis, specification, and then perform verification and validation on your product. You then submit those results to the regulators, who review your results and let you know that you've met the required standard. So it was from standing start. So March 21st to June 19th was the development of the submission to Health Canada that was ultimately successful. It was quite the ride. And of course, it wasn't over once the submission was done. There was still work to do to make the product better. But what were the essences of the success that let us do this? We had first of all, in development, we had a clear goal. We were going to develop a critical care ventilator, something that would provide therapy to patients in an ICU. That cut out a lot of questions, a lot of churn in the early stages of the project. And of course, we had our good baseline of a technology that worked from 30 years ago, but needed to be updated and manufactured in short order. It needed to be easy to use and supervise. We knew that constantly. The idea was that if you're going to end up in you can imagine stadium level situations where people are taking over the city's stadium and laying out aisles of beds with ventilators beside them. There weren't going to be enough trained supervisors to supervise each ventilator. They needed to be at a level that a medically knowledgeable person, a medical student, orthopedic surgeon, could be trained to use the product, and then could be supervised by respiratory therapists. So we set it up so that that was a clear goal. We also had to tackle risk relentlessly. So when we got to the end of this, we needed to be sure that the product was going to would work safely and would be effective. We promised ourselves that the product at the end would be safe. We would take all the shortcuts we could, take all the chances on the business level. If the consequence of failure was it cost us more money, we were very happy to do it. But if the consequence was that a patient wouldn't be safe, we did not take that. We would not take that shortcut. It would be mitigated. And so there's actually an interesting little sidebar here for those of you who manage projects such as this, is we were constantly had in mind the Challenger disaster, where senior management would ask the team, is there any risk? And the team would report, well, there's a moderate risk. And by the time it moved up the chain, that moderate risk had petered away to being nothing to worry about. And so we were very careful never to override, as much as we were overriding people's objections as to how fast they could move, we were very careful never to override objections as to safety. But so as well as the risk, we had to architect the product for development speed. We did a lot of testing, and then the big focus was on making the product manufacturable. And having that architected for development speed is, it's a choice that was made. And it paid off. It paid off very well. So to go back through those goals, so here we have if we look here on the left, we have patient support duration, so short duration, just immediate life saving, and then an extended duration, which can be weeks or even extending into months of duration. And then how sophisticated the treatment is. It could be either basic or sophisticated. And so a lot of the products and solutions that were being brought forward in an emergency, and some of you may have worked on these, was an emergency only immediate life preservation, which is basically a pump or a bag squeezer to squeeze air in and out of a patient, which would certainly save a life while other actions were being taken. There are also these transport ventilators, or ventilators used for at home, that are intended for people with a need of augmentation on their ventilation, but it doesn't provide all of the tools. And up here in the top right, there's a very sophisticated, very extended duration that provides all of the long-term support, enables the what's called the recruitment of the patient onto the therapy, and then the weaning of the patient off the therapy after they're feeling better. And so we chose to put ourselves right up here. This was the need. This is what hospitals were short of. If hospitals were going to turn to a device, certainly they'd turn to something in the short term. But if a large number of products were going to be used to sustain people's life, they needed to have full capability. And so being easy to use and supervise, we did a lot of testing. This is a mock-up of an ICU. You can see from the carpet that this is not an ICU. This is in one of our offices. We set this up and brought in respiratory therapists to give us feedback on the product and let us know how it was working. And you can see here our industrial designer with a paper card version of the product, and then our electronics engineer showing them the finished physical version of the product that we iterated a number of times. There was a lot of iteration went into this user interface. We reached out and worked out with people, all over Canada. People were very, very supportive and helpful to us. And then this is a closer up view of the interface. So there's the status report at the top, patient data next, and then the alarms that can be set the way an RT the respiratory therapist expects to be able to set them, and it gives all of the alarms that they're expecting, whether they're critical or informational. And then three key modes of ventilation: volume control, and pressure support, which enables a patient to breathe while the system is also breathing with them. And then as part of the architecture, so Starfish is a company, I think I told you we had 150 people, of all, including finance, HR, and everything else. On the peak of this project, there were 106 people at Starfish working on the project itself. But even with 106 people working on the project, it wasn't sufficient capacity to do everything that needed to be done. So the program was broken down into these subsystems. So the design and the firmware was done at Starfish. There was a pump module used to move the air. It was a non-standard pump. We were deliberately avoiding the standard supply chain for two reasons. One is we wanted it made in Canada so that the border issues that were existing at the time didn't apply. But also it seemed silly that if Medtronic was attempting to build a critical care ventilators that doctors were used to, that we would get in their way and be competing with them for components. So the pump module in this is a very different technology than is used in modern ventilators, and it was manufactured for us by a company that does pumps for RV recreational vehicles and boats. And so they had all of the technology to build and test it. They just needed to be taught how to do it and supervised. And so they stepped up and did that. Our circuit boards came from a PCBA manufacturer that Starfish, two PCBA manufacturers that Starfish knows well. We had our inventor and clinical testing happening in Manitoba. And then the cart enclosure was separated to a different company that was used to doing sheet metal work. Oxygen mixing and pneumatics and testing was another company. There was a user interface, which I'll show you an example of in a moment again. And then the final assembly, we did start, you will have heard a lot of talk of car manufacturers getting involved, and we were talking to MacDon, which is a farm equipment manufacturer in Manitoba, who were offered to help and provide their production line. In the end, we were able to recruit Celestica, who are a contract manufacturer with the medical device experience, to be our final assembly shop, and so that they were experts as well. So we were experts at the front end, They were experts at the back end, and between us, we pulled together all of these other suppliers, and they delivered. That they were given specifications, and they were given technical support, and then they delivered a finished module that fit that specification and came together in the ventilator. And I'll talk in a minute about how that all came together. Interesting. This is I don't know if any of you are musicians in Canada. This is Yorkville Instruments. They're the manufacturer for Long and McQuaid. Steve Long offered to help in this program, and it was a godsend, because if we were looking at the time to design, not only were we designing something that worked, we also had to design something where we could get thousands of components in a very, very short period of time. And so Yorkville reached out and told us, they normally make musical amplifiers, all sorts of mixing discs for DJs, anything that you've seen in their chain of stores across Canada. And they made their inventory available to us. And so our designers, both the industrial designers, user interface designers, the electrical designers, and then the team at Yorkville, all worked to identify what components Yorkville had in stock that we could design into the ventilator to provide the required needs. And this is what it ended up. And you saw on my timeline there that a physical version of the interface turned up within a couple of weeks of the start of the project. And it changed a lot of times, iterated a lot of times, but fundamentally it stayed the same during that program. But this is an example of the sorts of collaboration and cooperation that worked, and we had to be architected to work for this. Yorkville is not a medical device supplier. It doesn't actually have ISO 9000 as a quality system. It has its own quality system that is perfectly suitable for use in musical instruments and DJs. And so we had to up-qualify them as a medical supplier, which we did, and supervise them, and it worked very well. And that's an example. I could show you photographs of the other facilities that provided the other components. So then, we had, this was, there wasn't room for a lot of large iterations in this program. So how were all of these components going to work? So there were, pumps coming from the Greater Vancouver area, user interfaces coming from Ontario, and then we also had the pneumatic system that we did the oxygen mixing, and these are all critical pieces. The power supply, they all had to come together and work together. And clearly, we were working with very experienced systems engineers who did a good job of specifying what was important. But we recognized it was inevitable that, first of all, we would forget something, and second of all, we wouldn't understand fully the control that was required. So we picked we kept two pieces of it very flexible. The enclosure itself is sheet metal. And so sheet metal is a thing that you can change the setup on very quickly and create new parts with new dimensions without a lot of long tooling timeline. And so that was the motivation, so that everything would physically fit. If we made changes, if critical changes had to be made, we could easily make them without a lot of time wasted. And then the other piece was that the firmware control. So the firmware control was built from the ground up as bare C by the Starfish team, with an understanding of the sensors and with a very tightly controlled architecture. And actually reflected, we probably reached a stage of maturity on this that I could replace this. This is actual code from the control, but you guys might have been interested in seeing the architecture for the firmware. It's very, very simple, drawn very, very straightforwardly, and very tightly enforced. We put our head of software as the architecture enforcer, and then the firmware team iterated to fix problems. We ran a 24-hour cycle where there would be a release of code. It would be tested by Garrick here. Garrick would report what worked, what didn't work. When we discovered what didn't work, someone would then understand what the problem was, propose a solution, and then the firmware coders would code something that was architecturally compatible for release to be retested. And we just simply looped that through day by day. Discovered a few things along the way. One of the, because the entire team we were talking and so well connected, one of the things we had done is there was pneumatic controller that was happening that was just too slow. It was just too hard. It was very, very hard to get the control to work with this valve that was operating very slowly. And so even though we purchased a large number of them, we dumped them and moved to a different valve, and that enabled then the firmware control to work. But by and large, it was the firmware that was making the accommodations for the hardware rather than the other way around, simply because of lead times. Now, testing. Now, the other thing that is important to recognize. So Starfish develops a lot of products for people, and oftentimes when we're doing that, it's the first time this product has ever been attempted. So there's a lot of learning. In this case, ventilators are very mature technology, very mature use understanding, and there's a whole standard. ISO 8601 specifies what a ventilator needs, what a good ventilator is, and what a good ventilator isn't. So the goal was clear. We didn't, we were negotiating with Health Canada if we didn't meet all the specifications, and they were totally on board for that negotiation. But we didn't have to wonder what we were trying to achieve. So we tested it to 8601. 6601 is an electromechanical safety testing for all medical devices. Starfish is very used and experienced with that. Software 62304 speaks to software risk. We identified this as a Class C software, which is life-sustaining and so therefore took a very, very aggressive and, as I said, controlled approach to the software architecture. Risk management was under ISO 14971 and 62366. 62366 is a user risk. So in medical devices, it's not an acceptable risk to say, oh, it failed because of the user made a mistake. If the user made a mistake, you should have anticipated that, and the patient can't be harmed. It's probably, in passing, I'll also say for those of you used to other spaces, it's okay for medical devices to fail. They're not aircraft. So an aircraft, you can replace half the aircraft when it lands, but it can't fail mid-flight. A medical device, as long as you can, it's kind of the same, except you can imagine an off-ramp where if the device stops working, as long as the patient isn't harmed, that's okay. And so it just conceptually, that's a point to make. And then it was developed and manufactured under ISO 1345, which is the medical ISO 9000. And then we did a whole bunch of testing across 14 units. We had to get, there's a lot of testing needed to be done. So we segmented it by device and tested the design across 14 different units by over a dozen people, pushing towards a final submission to Health Canada. And here's more examples of some of that. So there's a tilt test. Does it fall over? Lots of repeated testing. This is some of the 8601 testing that I talked about, and then preliminary integration testing using a Bosch rail system. Finally, we got our approval from Health Canada. We had reached out to them right at the beginning and talked to them about shortcuts we planned to take, and the ones that they were comfortable with, ones that they were not. They were reassured. They were hearing from a lot of people at the time, if you can imagine. They were grateful to be talking to someone who understood medical devices, but that worked well. And so they gave us this interim authorization, which has been extended, and there's a clear pathway to what's called a medical device license. And then we kept testing. So we built these products, and we just wanted to understand, were they going to last? And so we set them up and just started running them. And these initial devices, these do not reflect the final product completely, but they're a fair representation of it. And we just turned them on and started them running so that we would gain evidence of where failures would occur. What was interesting is that I'm a hardware person primarily, as my background, reliability of telecom products is where I've come from. And so what actually the failures that we identified in this testing were largely firmware related. So eventually the firmware would fail for one reason or another, and then it had to be spun and a new version put out. But that was very, very valuable testing to be doing, even though it wasn't fully representative of the final product. Then in the end, to close the whole program out, we did take 30 devices and run them for an extended period of time, just to be confident that our statistics were good. We also did testing on pumps and valves. We did an analysis that showed the valves were not rated for the number of cycles that we were planning. So we did a very fast accelerated test on those and confirmed that they were good for our needs. And then we set up to be manufacturable. And so here, as you can see, this is Celestica's manufacturing facility. And we set them up in a position where they were able to build for us hundreds of these a week. All right, and pretty much finally, I think we did more testing. So we did a clinical test. We put these under an ethics board approval. We put these devices on patients. And these are a couple of the respiratory therapists in Winnipeg Health Sciences building. We had 20 patients that we ran for an extended duration. They were all comfortable with no issues. And we had some bench testing from external sources that our modes compared extremely well with getting a servo I and the Medtronic BB980, which are the two high-end ventilators. So we were very pleased with what we had achieved in terms of performance. So I could talk more about how we chose to spend money to go faster. There was a lot of parallel activities that didn't come to fruition. Happy to answer questions, but that's what we were doing. And really, I think the essence where we had a clear goal and we tackled risk relentlessly as we went through this. A lot of people were involved. We got a gold award from the Industrial Design Association. Thank you. So hopefully we've still got 10 minutes left for questions.
Impressive. Thank you very much for sharing this story. It's impressive to see that you were able to do that in the time frame of 2 months, and knowing that normally medical equipment has a long process of regulatory process to go through. And well, since we have 10 minutes only, I'll open the floor for questions.